my obviously I already spoke a bit on my fifth book, which I can't say too much about yet, but that was born of my researching a lot of Asian American
对，
racialization.
嗯哼，
Actually, I've been reading
已
this
经
book
有
recently called
，OK
Racial Melancholia, Racial Disassociation, and it's a
OK，
psychoanalytic approach to the kind of trauma that Asian Americans and diaspora Asians in particular go through.
嗯哼，
And yeah, like thinking more about the
嗯
unique
哼，
struggles of diaspora has become a very large part of my research in recent years, and will find its way into a lot more of my fiction in the future.
嗯哼。您又再一次的提到了南京大屠杀对你的一个震撼跟影响。那么我们也知道您的第一本书就把它 dedicate 给 Iris Chan， 就是张纯如小姐。很遗憾的是我们没有办法问她，但是很有意思的一件事情，你们两个都是在美国长大的华裔的第二代，但你们对于那一个事件中国人经历的事情，你们有很强的感觉。反而是这两个在美国长大的孩子对这一件事情有很强的感觉，但是一个很明显的事情是，现在这一些的年轻人对那一件南京大屠杀有感觉的不是很多。我说了，我们没有办法去问张纯如，但是我们可以问 Rebecca， 为什么你同样是一个在美国长大的快乐的华裔的第二代，这件事情对你的 impact 会这么的强，就像当年的张纯如一样。
Yeah, you're right. Iris Chang was a very big influence, and it's tragic that I'll never get the chance to meet her and talk about what inspired and motivated her. But I think in memory studies, there's a concept called prosthetic memory, and it's when a memory or a traumatic experience that a group of people did not personally undergo becomes adopted by them, and they make that memory part of their identity, and something that shapes the way that they interact with the world. And I'm guessing, well, it's a pretty strong guess because Iris also writes about this in her book, but for both of us, I think growing up in the US and then learning that this had happened, and then feeling very strongly as though it had been covered up and ignored and overlooked by the West, in the same way that a lot of contributions by Chinese Americans to American history have been overlooked, was something that was deeply both frustrating and motivating, because I think we're both motivated to tell that story. And it's still something, and Iris Chang also wrote another book that is not as well known, I think, as The Rape of Nanjing, but I'm forgetting the title, but it's about the history of Chinese Americans in the US and their contributions to this country. And Chinese American history is still not something that is taught really in US high schools. It's not something that we Chinese Americans are told about unless we go and seek that out for ourselves. So my theory is that we're both motivated by wanting to write the Chinese diaspora and the history of Chinese people and Chinese Americans into a larger national narrative that has largely ignored us. And she did it by making an intervention in the historical canon, and I did it by making an intervention in the canon of fiction, because that's what I just happen to be better at. But yeah, if I were to guess, I would say that's what we both saw in the Nanjing massacre.
对于这一点，我不知道，其实 Rebecca 你也有很多的同伴，我们说亚洲的第二代，跟你差不多的年龄，还这么年轻，可能他们有的时候只觉得自己是一个亚裔的女孩子，她对于中国的这一个的情感或者这个历史的部分是没有太深情感，甚至她对于自己认同自己，我自己是不是中国人、美国人，可能她都不太觉得跟中国有极强的关系。但是你跟他们是一样长大的人，但你却有这么强的一个想要把你中国的历史或中国的东西写成你的文章。你觉得你这个部分的一个 mission 也好 vision 也好，是来自于父母呢，还是来自你自己给你自己的一个 期许希望我做你这个认同是很早就有的呢，还是你慢慢才成型的？
I think it's a little bit of both. I certainly, when I was growing up, really didn't have any interest in Chinese
对，
history or
嗯哼，
Chinese culture. I enjoyed going to Meihua supermarket on Saturdays, and I enjoyed the food my mom
对，
made.
嗯
But
哼，
otherwise,
没有
I
了，
wasn't really motivated to learn about where I had come from, or even motivated to learn Chinese. I remember having fights with my dad because he wanted me to go to Chinese lessons on Sundays, and I thought they were boring,
嗯哼，
and didn't see what the point was. And in a way, it was, I think, for a lot of first generation Chinese Americans, this refusal to accept the Chinese part of your identity is a survival tactic. Because when you're one of like the three kids in your entire school who isn't white,
嗯哼，
you just want to talk like the other kids and look like the other kids, and you want to blend in, and you don't really want to focus on the things that make you different. So I don't I completely understand why a lot of Asian Americans try to assimilate as much as possible, because it makes life easier, to be honest. But for me in particular, I just couldn't let go of what I knew was a part of my legacy and my heritage that I had been cut off from for so long. And I think I was uniquely driven in wanting to orient my entire life around this. But I also think you're wrong that most Asian Americans, or Chinese Americans rather, don't care too much about their heritage. Because most Chinese Americans that I've encountered are actually really excited to read novels by Chinese American writers,
嗯
to learn
哼，
about Chinese American history. It's just that they've never been exposed to it. You're not exposed to it in middle school or high school because it's not a part of the American curriculum, and you're not really exposed to it in college. But actually, an interesting phenomenon happens in college where you go and suddenly all these classes on
嗯
Chinese
哼，
language and Chinese history and culture are available. And you find kids who are exactly like me in a level one heritage speaker class, right? We have so many Chinese Americans who are in my same position who grew up hearing Chinese and have an ear for tones and can understand very basic vocabulary, but don't really know any Chinese beyond that, who now that they're in college and they have the opportunity, they
对，
really want to learn.
嗯哼，
And these classes fill up every single year.
嗯哼，
So I don't think it's an issue of Chinese Americans not having an interest in China. I think it's a cultural issue of those cultural materials to act as a bridge not really existing up until now. And now there's more and more. I mean, Shang-Chi just came out, right?
对呀、
Like, and I think
嗯哼，
that kind of big blockbuster
是的，
Marvel
嗯哼，
film that showcases a lot of that, like at least 50% of the dialogue is in Chinese. I think
嗯
I
哼，
think that's going to motivate kids to want to watch more Hong Kong kung fu films and Hong Kong gangster movies, and to learn more about wuxia and,
嗯
and,
哼。
and kung fu, and get excited about Chinese culture. So yeah, I think I'm unique in that I decided to build my entire career
是
around Chinese history and culture. But I think a lot of diaspora kids like me are hungry for those connections and hungry for the cultural materials that will
嗯
let
哼
them rebuild those connections.
，good。我相信 Rebecca 刚刚那句话，如果给所有的华裔第二代听到，其实是很棒的。当然，我们正鼓励像 Rebecca 这样的人能够多写一些这些，然后让这些孩子有更多的认同。Rebecca，我有一个问题想要问你：你从高中时代，你就是辩论里流的辩才无碍的一个好的很棒的人。你要晓得，辩论能够在辩论比赛里头表现很好的人，通常他的逻辑是非常非常强，就是因为有很强的逻辑，你在倾听跟你在答辩的时候，你都能够展现你的逻辑。通常逻辑强的人，他的情感会比较弱一点，或者他压抑掉这个部分。但是我们从你的书里头看到，其实你有很深的情感，就如同你对于南京大屠杀的这一份情感的东西，你又是一个非常情感的人。你是一个如何能够 balance 你这个逻辑跟你情感的一个人，你可以告诉我们吗？
I'm gonna push back a little on that. I don't think that the secret to being good at debate is logic. I
Oh,
think
OK，
that being rational and understanding logical arguments is a fundamental building block of being good at debate. Of course, you have to be able to evaluate what arguments are good, what arguments are bad, what the best point of attack is, where your opponent's weak points are, etc. But the key to winning a debate round is emotion. Because at the end of the day, you are not debating to like a computer or a machine that is just sorting through arguments and determining who's right. You're talking to a flesh and blood human person who is swayed by strong rhetoric and like good examples and anecdotes. And so I think debate is maybe 40% logic, right? And
OK，
60% learning how to speak and how to use your body language and how to present yourself in a room and how to
嗯哼
deliver a speech in the most emotional and effective way possible because it's not about logic, it's about persuasion, right?
，OK，
And I think it's those skills that carried over into storytelling because my books are argumentative. They are based on points I want to make the same way that I was when I was a debater. But the reason why the books do well and the reason why readers can connect with them is because all of that is wrapped in very strong human emotion and passion and inner urges as a way to connect to the reader. So I think writing books for an audience and debating for a judge are very similar, and that at the end of the day, it's about talking to another person and
OK，
figuring out what's going to convince them, and
是，
it's really not about logic at all.
嗯哼。那谈一谈你情感深重的部分。那么，我觉得 Rebecca 你有情感，比方说你把你的第一本书献给了张纯如，你的第二本书献给了6个人啊。那么有没有特别的情感？对于这，刚刚你已经谈到了你对 Iris 张的一种 respect 的部分。谈谈看你的第二本书 Dedicate， 因为你把这6个人特别放在你的书里头，要感谢。有什么特别的因缘是这6个人在你的这个写作的过程中扮演很重要的角色
They're my grandparents.
？OK，嗯哼，嗯哼，你对他们还是有相当深的情感，虽然你那一年是第一次跟他们有比较亲密的接触，然后你能够了解那一代的中国人经历的许多的苦难，那个东西有在你的心上留到一些什么吗？因为很多在这边长大的第二代不是那么喜欢听 grandparent 那一代的故事，但是他们那一代走过的比较辛苦的东西，你是记录下来的，你在你的感觉里头是记下来的。
Yeah, I wrote that trilogy for my family, for my parents, and for my grandparents
嗯哼，
because studying modern Chinese history is personal for me because when I understand what happened during the Second Sino-Japanese War, when I learn about the Cultural Revolution, when I think about the Great Leap Forward and the famine and all the vicissitudes of the 20th century, those are not just abstract events that happened in another country. Those are events that my grandparents not only suffered through but survived and were resilient enough to produce my parents who produced me. So that there's a great deal of indebtedness there because without their sacrifices and without everything that they'd suffered, I would not be in a position to be able to write about it. So in a lot of ways, I'm the lucky generation.
是
I'm the
的，
one who grew up never having to worry about political struggle and never having to worry about where I was going to get my next meal. I mean, I've seen the school building that my dad attended elementary, middle school in, and I mean, it's dirt floors, right? There's no electricity.
嗯哼，
It's an environment that I could not imagine even concentrating in, and he works so hard there, and managed to get himself to Beida, and then managed to get himself to Cornell, and to
嗯哼，
bring us to the U.S. where I got the
嗯哼，
best education that that you could ask for. and I never had to do anything difficult. It was all them. So of course I dedicate my novels to them because
Mhm,
they are the generations that suffered all the trials and tribulations that it's my great honor to just get to chronicle and document.
嗯哼。当然，你的最后一本，你也献给了那些陪同你一起走过来的所有的读者，然后说的这一些的跟着眼泪存留的部分，有没有一个部分是你 Rebecca， 当你写完第3本书的时候，你也跟这个罂粟的战争说告别，所以你有些许的感伤在里头，或者愿意或者不愿意做这一份的告别。
I was really glad to be done with the trilogy. It felt like closing a chapter on my life and really finally being allowed to grow up and pursue something new because you have to understand I wrote the first book when I was 19 and by the time that the third book came out I was 24. So that
嗯
was
哼，
5 years of my
对，
life working on
嗯
this
哼，
trilogy. And there are also 5 years that in which I think those can be the most important years of someone's life. Like those are the years in which you graduate from college and get your first job, find your first apartment, and become an adult. And I was in the interesting position of growing up on the page in public to tens of thousands of readers.
嗯哼，
And people had watched me evolve and change and mature as a writer over the course of that trilogy. So by the time the last book was out, I was really happy to be able to wrap things up and put this trilogy out there
是，
as kind of like a living document that
嗯哼，
chronicled my intellectual
嗯哼，
maturation,
嗯
but which also signaled that I'm an adult now. I'm grown. I graduated college. I got 2 master's degrees, and I'm ready to tackle newer, more difficult stuff. So I think actually, so sometimes I think of those novels as my training wheel novels because they're a bit messy. The first one was written by a teenager.
是
Of
的，
course,
嗯
it's
哼，
going to be messy. Of course, it's going to have a little bit more, not so sophisticated writing. I think the writing gets better as the trilogy goes on, but it was the process of writing those novels that taught me how to write and
嗯
now I think whatever projects I pursue I'm so much better equipped to make them they're just going to be better books
嗯哼，
so yeah, I think in the same way, right, that like child actors are glad to graduate from the Disney Channel and
是
start acting as adults in serious dramatic films. I was also really glad to graduate from the trilogy and to
是，
put out work that more better represents who I've become since I've
是的，
graduated.
嗯哼。Rebecca，你曾经说过了，就是说这个样的书人家有访问过你说，你觉得你的书可不可以变成电影？你说好像在好莱坞的世界里头还没有一个全亚裔，但你刚提到了上亿这部电影，突然成为美国票房最好的，已经第3个礼拜了。OK，那你这个时候会不会觉得说，我的罂粟战争3部曲搬上荧幕的可能性，对你来说是越来越有兴趣，而且你有信心他们是可以在市场上站下来的，有吗？
Honestly, maybe. The success of Shang-Chi really
是
changed my
的，
mind.
嗯哼，
I was very nervous
嗯哼，
about that film before it came out because I knew that no matter how good it was and no matter how good the acting was, it was going to be expected to carry the burden of representing an entire demographic.
嗯
I
哼，
think all future projects about Asian Americans in Hollywood, especially in action films, were going to live or die based on how Shang-Chi did.
嗯哼，
Which is an unimaginable burden for the
嗯
actors
哼，
for the whole team involved
啊哈，
and then it did so well. It did so well at the box office, and I
嗯
went and
哼
saw it last week, and
，Yeah，
um, I think it's fine. I think the best parts of it are the parts that are uniquely Asian. So the cast and the parts that are
是
set in China.
OK，
I think the worst parts of it are actually due to the Marvel formula. The fact that at the end of the day, it's an
啊，
MCU superhero film.
嗯哼，嗯哼，
Um, and it's part of a very large franchise, but like it brought something fresh and new and really exciting to the MCU, and I think people resonated with that. And now I think we're gonna get more Hollywood films with Asian
是的，
casts,
嗯
and
哼，
I don't know if The Poppy War is going to be one of them, but I hope so. It's currently been optioned for TV by Starlight
嗯哼，
Productions,
嗯哼，
and the last I heard, they were looking for a showrunner. So
嗯哼。
we'll see.
不
Never
过
say
我
no.
相信，我相信以瑞贝卡这样丰富的一个创作，你将来会有很多的作品会被搬上电影或者电视剧。不过瑞贝卡，我想问你，所有的情形都是一开始的时候会非常难。你19岁写下了这本书，很快的你被出版社签了约。你要晓得多少，很多的华裔第二代也想写啊，但是能够真正成名的，毕竟还是少数。但是呢，你可不可以分享一下，究竟你那个时候的困难，找出版社看到你，或者怎么样让人家知道你有这个东西？你有没有丢了很多都被退回来的情形？你的尝试后来成功的秘诀是什么？
Um, Actually, my process to publication was pretty smooth. I think I got really lucky,
嗯
and I
哼，
entered the market at a good time. So I had a literary agent in just a couple of, I think, weeks, and I think we also got a book deal in a couple weeks or months, if that. And so I didn't receive that many rejection letters. And I was really astonished by how easy it
嗯
felt.
哼，
The part of the process that did feel difficult for me was when the book first came out, it was not a bestseller. And people are always kind of surprised to hear this. And I have to explain that in the US book economy, the books that become bestsellers are 99% of the time, it's because the publisher decided to put a lot of advertising money behind them. Make sure they got in the front of bookstores, make sure they're distributed by book clubs, etc. Right? Like they spend ad money on them. And the Poppy War was not expected by
嗯
anyone
哼，
to be a bestseller
嗯
because they
哼，
just weren't sure that the audience was out there. So the day that it came out, I felt really disappointed and kind of let down, and also very scared that this
哦，
book was going to flop and that nobody would care about it and that I would never get another writing contract again. And the first few weeks were very difficult because I felt like I hadn't found an audience and that the book was not going to succeed. But then something weird happened. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that sales were not only remaining steady, they were getting better and better. And more people were talking about it on social media. And what happened was that the book had grown organically, which is something that nobody really believes happens anymore, but it's true. People read it, liked it, and they told their friends about it, and their friends bought it, and then told their friends about it. And it spread through word of mouth. And I think it found an audience that even publishers didn't really know was out there, an audience that does care about Chinese history and culture and wants to see more Chinese American representation in Anglophone science fiction and
嗯
fantasy. So I got so lucky by having very enthusiastic readers and fans who, I mean, the book is selling better this year than the year that it came out,
是
which is almost never true of books, right? Like they usually sell the best in the first
right，
few months
嗯
that
哼，
they're
嗯
released,
哼
and then it's a slow trickle of sales.
，Yeah，
But the opposite is happening for
是，
me. So I would say to um, aspiring writers out there,
嗯哼
especially Chinese American writers,
，Right，
that it can feel like there's not an audience for your book because the market hasn't figured out what to do with your stories
嗯
yet.
哼，
And I mean, think about it from my perspective. When I saw The Poppy War, there was one other fantasy novel that had been published by a major publisher that was by a Chinese American writer, and
嗯
that was
哼，
The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. But there's only that one novel. So of course I thought this is never going to sell. There's not a market space for this. People don't care about this kind of story. But in just the past 5 years, there's not been a flood, but there's been a trickle of more fantasy titles by Chinese Americans and people in the Chinese diaspora.
嗯
Fondeli's,
嗯哼，
the Green Bone Saga,
嗯
which
哼，
is like the Godfather meets kung fu gangster films.
嗯哼
There's also She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, which I believe
，OK，
is about the
嗯
Ming
哼，
Dynasty,
嗯哼，
and lots more. And and publishers are starting to realize that that audience is out there and that they buy a lot of books. So just have faith in the importance of your story, because the readers are they exist, and the readers are people like you who, when growing up, couldn't find books about themselves on library shelves, and now really, will throw money at titles if they can feel themselves represented in it. So just don't give up, keep going.
Good. 谢谢 Rebecca 给所有的年轻的作家都有一些的鼓励。Rebecca， 我来问你一下，因为你算是成名的非常的早，你19岁就出了这本书，然后出版社直接就签了你，然后你继续写了第4本、第5本书。有没有因为你比很多的作家都要成名的早，而且这么快被人家知道，你这5年6年来，你有没有一个 bottleneck， 就是说是被那一个成名的早的 fan 或者被一个 best selling 的一个东西影响到你这个人的创作？你有没有一段时间是我很难突破的感觉？有没有过在这6年当中？
I don't think so. And the reason why is I try very hard to make sure that I'm not peaking early.
Okay.
There's a good Chinese myth actually, and I'm forgetting the name, but it's about this child prodigy, right, who can memorize all these poems and is brilliant. But then when he's an adult, his whole life feels wasted and he's a failure because
小时了了，大未必佳。
Yeah, I mean, I learned that story when I was a child, and I mean, that prospect terrifies me. So I try to keep things in perspective by thinking, if I could write the Poppy War at 19, well, the book that I write at 25 must be much, much better. So for that reason, I try not to read too many of my readers' reviews. I try not to think very much about how my books are selling or where I am, but I'm constantly just trying to make myself a better writer because the way I think of it is I'm only at the very start of my career. I'm not even 30 yet, and most people publish their first novels after they're 30. So I'm viewing all of this as training for the real stuff. And I've gotten lucky in that I've had some pretty successful novels, but I'm constantly reading other authors, trying to learn from them and get better at my own prose. And I'm very happy to admit that my earlier works have mistakes. And I'm never going to be happy with my level of achievement because if it's starting to feel easy for me, then that means I need to be working harder and that I need to reach the next level. So as long as I never let myself feel like I've reached the peak, then hopefully I think my work is just going to get better from here.
Rebecca 已经有很多成品、很多 products 的人，他们最害怕的是看他最早的成品。因为最早的成品他在看的时候觉得那个时候不够成熟，有很多我可以写得更好，或者我可以拍得更好，或者我可以演得更好。你有没有这种情形？你会不会已经碰到是说，我虽然你的第1本书其实是一个最大的影响的，当然你有后面的2、3本，那你有没有也有一种情感情怯，是说我不是那么敢看我的第1本书？你有没有这种情形？
Of course. I haven't looked at that book in years. Well, think of it this way. Because a book is so deeply personal, you put so many of your emotions and thoughts and feelings about the world into it. And imagine if somebody found your teenage diary, right, that you had written just for yourself and then put it on shelves for thousands and thousands of people to read. And no matter, how much you matured or grew from that self, that's always how people saw you. That's how I feel about the Poppy War. I'm proud of that book. I think it's a good book. I'm excited that it does well, but I feel like the person who wrote it is already a complete stranger to me. The way we think about the world is so different. The way we write and come up with characters and tell stories is so different. And I feel like I'm better. I feel like I'm older and smarter and have learned a lot more, and that person was naive and bold, but not that good of a writer yet. So that's something that I've had to make peace with. The fact that when most people encounter me as a writer, they are encountering a version of me that does not exist anymore. but I'm hoping that my next works will
永远是
be
最
more
好的，
popular
更快
and
速
sell
会，
better, and
嗯
that
哼，
I'll have a chance to represent who I am now
是
to
的，
to a
嗯
wider
哼，
audience.
嗯哼，内在的一个piece， 我觉得是最重要的。我们今天真的非常高兴跟 Rebecca 聊了这么多，而且谈得这么好。Rebecca， 你今天也提到了好多你成长的经验，在我们节目结束之前，因为你是一个从小也在父母的引导当中做了很多父母期望中做的事情，然后你刚好也很幸福，你也成功，你也做到了父母的期许。可不可以在这里分享？因为如果今天给你重回来一趟，你认为你父母给你的那些教育的方法，如果你想给一些同样的中国父母给一些教育的或一些建议的话，你会很想跟这些中国父母应该用什么样的方式来教育你们的第二代，特别在美国长大的人？你认为，因为你是一个在很多中国父母希望的照着规矩中长大的孩子，刚好你也没有那么的叛逆，你也没有那么好，你就一直有你自己的 pattern 走过来，但并不是所有的家庭都如此。那今天你愿不愿意对这些中国的父母，可能还是用同样的方法来教育，就像你说的，所有的第一代移民的不放 insecure 种种，他们还是用那样的方式教育他的孩子。你会给这些中国父母一些什么样的建议呢？
I don't really feel qualified telling people how to be parents,
是
because I don't
是，
have kids and I don't know how difficult that
从你
is.
的经验里头看，
But
回过
but
来
if
看，
I could tell my own parents
是，
something about
OK
how they raised me, well, first I would say thank you,
OK，
because that can't have been easy and you made a lot of sacrifices.
是
But second, that because I think they did the right thing for me. They saw a passion that I cared a lot about, and they moved mountains
是
to make pursuing that passion possible for me. And I'm alluding to here when they made all the sacrifices to let me go to Greenhill and be a competitive debater in high school. I think a lot of Chinese families wouldn't have agreed because my grades did suffer, and maybe if I'd stayed at a different high school, I would have had a
嗯哼
higher GPA.
嗯哼
And it was a really big burden on them. So I would say if you see in your child a true passion and
嗯
something
哼
that they could
嗯
really
哼
succeed at and
嗯
care a lot about, then instead of expecting them to adhere to a certain mode of success, get into a good college, go to law school or be a doctor or
是
be an accountant, etc.
嗯哼
Maybe be open, right,
嗯
to
哼
more non-traditional careers like acting or singing. We need more Chinese American actors
嗯哼
or writing.
嗯哼
And yeah, maybe they'll fail, but it matters when you're really young to be able to explore those opportunities. And I feel really, really lucky that my parents let me do that.
这是对父母从自身对父母的经验，就是说感谢他父母有这么一个开放的心灵。我相信也鼓励很多华人的父母给孩子有更多开放的空间，然后去发现他们真正热情的所在。如果我再要求你说跟这一些在美国长大的第二代像你这样，因为你现在真的还是非常年轻，在成长中的 teenager 很可能这些人都是在你的 popular world 里头找到他们自己非常棒的 fantasy 的东西，然后他们可能有很多的 conflict 或者跟父母之间。如果我会要求你说对他们说一些在这里长大，不管你自己刚才分享的在过程当中也经历过一些的种种跟人家的不同，你会给第二代的华裔一些什么样的建议或者分享？
I would say try to read some novels by Chinese writers in translation,
OK
because there is a lot that I didn't understand about my parents' generation
嗯
and
哼
where they'd come from and the things that they'd been through. But after reading literature by their contemporaries and understanding kind of the environment in which they'd grown up and what they left behind, I I think I see my parents in a different light.
Mhm.
So if you're having a difficult time, communicating with your family because of that cultural difference, I think maybe try reading about where they might have come from and see if you can build a foundation for having conversations about that.
我觉得这是一个非常好的建议，可能对一些年轻一代的人，当我还找不到我认同，透过一些的书的这个讲到这些的历程时候，对你自己的原生家庭会有更一些的了解。我们非常感谢 Rebecca 今天接受我们的访问。最后谈谈看你的新的计划，你的方向，有可能你会变成一个写剧本的人吗？因为你的这个想象空间这么的大，然后或者除了作家之外，你还可能去做别的东西吗？那 after 你完成了你的博士学位之后，
I'm certainly going to have 3 more books come out after the Poppy War. One of them, Babel, has already been announced. One of them will be announced soon, and
Good.
one of them I have not started writing yet, and need to get on that because the deadline is not too far away. But I'm also pursuing my PhD in East Asian languages and literatures here at Yale, and yeah, I'm working on a dissertation, as I said, about contemporary Chinese literature and diaspora Chinese literature and how they interact with each other and how translation plays a part in that. So my hope is to become a professor and teach Chinese literature and Asian American literature to students who were just like me and wanted to explore their heritage and culture more. So yeah, I really want to be a professor, and that's what I hope the future holds for me.
希望你能够开一个电视节目，把你这个在教授上所要教学的东西，让更多的华裔的年轻看到这里。非常非常谢谢 Rebecca 在你这么忙的读书的过程，还在写作的压力之下接受我们的访问。我相信今天这样的谈话对很多人来讲，我们不管是上一代下一代，特别是对于你所完成的一切，我们非常的感谢，同时也祝福你真的有更好的未来。每一本书虽然那比较 commercial， 但每一本书都大卖，好不好？然后每一本书都会接到整个市场上的欢迎。我相信我们每一个人都会以你为荣。谢谢 Rebecca 今天参加我们的节目，谢谢。
Well, thank you so much for having me.
谢谢。我们也感谢所有朋友您今天的收看。我们期待今夜10点见会给您推出更多更棒的人物专访。我们再次感谢 Rebecca， 我们同时也祝福她。谢谢，感谢，再见。拜拜。